Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Christadelphians Present, a informative, biblical, and very thought-provoking program that today we will be looking into Bible prophecy and the way it has played itself out in this day and age, entitled Earthquakes, Disasters, and the End of the World. We have a very interesting two-part program, and to introduce that to us is Mr. Martin Webster, a Bible scholar of Bible prophecy as well as current events. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. Martin, what is it about earthquakes that the Bible is full of reference to and always in alignment with God's divine hand involved?
Well, it's a very interesting topic, Peter, because people have always been interested in things that they don't know anything about. There has always been a certain fear of events that are very sudden, very dramatic. For example, if we think about the fact that the human mind is moved by these events, by these phenomena, and we think about August the 6th in 1945, that was a very dramatic event in the world because it was on that day that the world was numbed by the news of the explosion of the first atomic bomb used in warfare in Hiroshima in Japan. And in a matter of seconds, the lives of thousands of people were destroyed. The city of Hiroshima was destroyed. And that event numbed the world, and for several days people were in a state of shock. This fear that we have, naturally speaking, the fear that all of us have of things that are so sudden, is very evident, for example, much more recently. Consider 9/11, the events in New York. A shudder went through the spines of many people in the world, and not only those events that are man-made disasters and events, but there's also this natural fear of things that are natural. For example, solar and lunar eclipses have instilled fear in people for many thousands of years, and even today there's some superstition about total solar eclipses. There's some sense of wonder about these events.
And particularly in the Dark Ages, where people had no explanation and always put it down to portents that they had no control over, and there was nothing scientific to back up to assuage them of their fear.
That is right. Today we know what a solar eclipse is, and it doesn't bring particular concern. But in the days when people didn't know about things, in natural events were considered to be a herald of doom. For example, comets. Very natural things in the heavens, but people were not were very fearful of them. They were viewed to be events that were the portents of death and doom. When one appeared, it was taken to be an indication of the death of a king or some other great calamitous events.
Very interesting.
And it wasn't until Edmund Halley, in the early 18th century, determined that these comets were natural events that simply recurred and came again, that people began to understand what they were. And there's always been this fascination for this kind of thing, and concerns about when will the world end, or how will it end. And there's various bases of Bible prophecies that have come to our minds. For example, the fear of the end of the world and the Mayan calendar, of great concern to people. And again, consider this famous French one, Nostradamus, his predictions concerning the end of the world. Consider 1999. He anticipated that the world would end in 1999, the time of Y2K.
Well, without dating ourselves, he quite got it wrong.
He did indeed.
And the the comparison that is really obviously going to leap forward is, how does the Bible, as you'd mentioned, have its prophecies? How does it stand up to some of these other prophecies that have come and gone with the ages?
That's an interesting question, Peter, because when we look at, say, the predictions of Nostradamus, there's really quite a vague element to them. For example, he predicted that a mighty dictator would arise in Europe in the last times. Well, one could look at that and say it's Napoleon or Hitler. In contrast to this, in the Bible, what we have are some very specific Bible prophecies that are given to us, and this is a very good example to us based on the 2nd chapter of the book of Daniel, where the emperor of the Roman Empire, of the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, had this dream, and it was a dream of prophecy concerning nations and empires that would occupy the territory of the Middle East, not only in his day, but in subsequent times. And you can see on the screen that we have represented there the 4 empires, from the Babylonian down to the Roman Empire, that actually occupied this particular territory in the earth. And that at a certain point in time, there would exist in this territory a mix of nations, some strong, some weak, represented by the iron and clay of the feet. And all this was fulfilled very precisely, as you can see from the dates that are on the screen, as these empires successively came onto the world scene.
Well, it says at the bottom on the right that these are the end times, which you could say this scenario has so much in common with one after the other, not only specific eras, but in the exact order. And always it seems to be pointing forward to Israel somehow.
That is correct. There is a strong link with these 4 empires, with the territory and the nation of Israel, that all those empires, they occupied the area that Israel occupies today. And when you look at that part of the world, which was occupied by those 4 empires, it's now a mix of nations, some strong, some weak. But what happened in this great vision that the king had was that this organization that is termed the kingdom of men came to an end rather dramatically.
Yes.
A stone came out of a mountainside and crashed into this image on its feet, crushed it into dust that was blown away, and then this stone in itself magnified and grew and grew and grew until it filled the face of the whole earth. And that stone represents Jesus Christ, who will come back, replace the kingdom of men with a kingdom that will never be destroyed, a kingdom of peace, plenty, and prosperity for all the citizens of the world.
So it sounds like his second coming will have earth-shattering ramifications.
It will have earth-shattering ramifications that are going to be very significant to the era in which we live. But before we get that far in our discussions, Peter, let's think about some of the causes of earthquakes. For example, the earth is made up of a series of very large plates, and they're like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle.
Yes.
They fit together. And when we look at a map of the world, we see a diagram of these major plates, some of them large and some of them small. And in fact, if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that the Persian Peninsula is circled by these fault lines, and the line goes across through the Mediterranean Sea. And that's significant because in the politics of the world today, how often is the Middle East away from the headlines in the paper or on television?
It always
really
there.
isn't.
Yes,
it's always there.
Indeed.
And
events.
these plates have a significant position in regard to the events that relate to us today, but more of that a little later on. These plates are always in motion. They're traveling just a few centimeters per year, and they push against each other with enormous force. For example, the distance between Europe and North America will increase by approximately 2 meters over the lifetime of most people, about 80 years. Now that is going to create enormous pressure upon these plates, which will manifest itself in significant events. And the ocean floors are moving, as we say, they're spreading.
Yes.
And what happens is that in this pushing, the plates, as they push one another against one another, one will slide under the other. And in the sliding under, there will be a physical consequence that will be manifested in an earthquake or a volcano or in some major events like this. Something has to give when the pressure grows.
And a lot of these epicenters of some of the most massive earthquakes do start on the ocean's floor, where we don't see its beginnings, but we certainly have seen how it's manifested in themselves.
Indeed, indeed. And sometimes the manifestation is very significant. So, for example, the earth shuddered in Haiti just before 5 in the afternoon on the 12th of January 2010. This magnitude 7 earthquake that took the lives of thousands of people and just devastated Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, came so suddenly, without any warning. And it was one of those events that was difficult to predict, but the consequences are very far-reaching.
Just as a side note, I noticed that you've only got pictured pretty well the western half of the island. There is another nation on the eastern side, known as the Dominican Republic, but it's almost as if earthquakes have been pinpointed so that, as there is just a political line, the earthquake did its damage on the western side of the island, destroying one nation while leaving the other side of the island virtually untouched.
Yes.
Strange.
Yes, it is a strange thing, but earthquakes are not politically sensitive. As, for example, again, you think this occasion, February 2011, Christchurch, New Zealand.
Yes.
A mighty earthquake that had a devastating effect on that very famous cathedral that that we can see in the diagram there. Then just a few weeks later, we have on the coast of Japan, near the city of Sendai, that massive magnitude 9 earthquake that had a devastating effect upon that part of the world. And in fact, when we look at the cause of the tsunami that came upon Japan at that time, we see that the sea floor shifted. All of a sudden, one part was raised, and in this particular case off the coast of Sendai, it was raised about 2 meters. It caused a wave to start moving toward the coast of Japan, quite rapidly at first. Fairly shallow wave, but as the sea wave moved toward the shore, the water became shallower. The pace of the wave slowed down, but the force was not diminished. And as a result of that, when it came ashore, it had a devastating effect, as we can see in this video clip. You can see in this clip, the vehicles have been picked up but are being tossed about. The sea is coming across the sea wall, and it's not fast, it's relentless. And the force of the water that is coming has a devastating effect, as we can see in this clip that was taken from a building and from an observer who obviously survived this tragic disaster. And we'll see that that green roofed building is actually picked up and moved. We'll see these vehicles that are in the car park are going to be picked up and moved by this wave of water that is coming in. And the amazing thing, Peter, is that nothing will stop this force of water until it has expended its energy several kilometers inland.
And as you said, it is relentless.
It is. Nothing will stop it, and as you can see now, the volume of water is increasing as it comes between these buildings. It's going to drive with great force, picking up those vehicles that were in the car park that we saw a moment ago, forcing them against that long building. We're going to see in just a minute that that building is actually picked up and just swept away by the waves. We're going to see that other buildings, that green roof building, is picked up and just moved toward that concrete building and is smashed against it. Great vehicles like tractor trailers picked up and float about the surface of the water almost like a piece of cork. And there's nothing that can stop it.
It reminds you somewhat of the scenario of as it was in the days of Noah, that anything that was not in the ark was swept aside. And obviously, when you see concrete buildings are pretty well the only things that's surviving, that it's an obvious spiritual significance of we need to be on firm ground in a literal and in a symbolic sense.
Right. And the people who are observing this tsunami are on a very safe, they're in a building that's on a sure foundation, and that's very significant. But look at that house. Look at that building with the green roof. It's being pushed against the concrete building.
The contents are
The contents are being spewed out. The tractor trailer that was there has been forced away. And we can see how forceful that water is. And in fact, in the end, that green roof building is swept around that large concrete building. And we can see people at the top of that concrete building there watching and observing. And the water still keeps coming on and coming on. Nothing is stopping it until, as I say, it has expended its natural energy much later. And we'll see that building there. Just watch it, that long building there that's being swept off its foundations and is being taken away in the torrent. And that picture gives us a sense of what happened in one part of Japan as a result of this mighty earthquake that came. And I think that's sufficient for us to see at this particular point in time, because what we're going to go on is to consider the important principle that we have behind these kinds of events.
Can I just ask, Martin, I know that only took a few minutes of the quake, but how many people actually died during that tsunami?
It was nearly 16,000 people, Peter. And you think about that, in a matter of minutes.
In a matter of minutes.
The lives of those people were taken.
And
once they were swept up in that, there was nothing they could do to stop it. But there's an important principle behind these events. You see, the elements of nature are in the hands of God, and he uses them to develop his purpose with the earth. So, for example, when God speaks to Job, he asks him the question, have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and of war? And there are historical events when wars have changed their course because of the outpouring of rain and hail. And another important principle to appreciate is the psalmist says in this poetry taken from Psalm 147, when he's speaking poetically, praise the Lord from the earth, you great creatures, and all deeps of fire and hail, snow and mist, stormy wind fulfilling his word. And we look at biblical history and we find that in relation to the nation of Israel, those descendants of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, they migrated to Egypt where they grew into a great nation. And after many years of persecution, Moses led the nation out of Egypt through the Red Sea, through that great corridor through the Red Sea. And it was a stormy wind that created the path through that sea that enabled them to escape the slavery. And we find that the earthquakes in the Bible are quite frequent. So a little later in Israel's history, for example, when they got to the land of promise, the first city they came to was the city of Jericho. But before that time, they came to Mount Sinai, where they received their laws, where they received their system of government. And at that place, after due preparation, they witnessed the power of God was manifest to them. And it was done with a spectacular manifestation of God's power in events such as is described here, that Moses brought the people of Israel out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because of the Lord that had descended on it in fire, and the smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood afar off. Why? Because the people were absolutely terrified.
This is the same awesome power of God on display, but as of yet he has not brought out any destruction.
That is right. Nothing happened to these people. And the purpose of this is significant, because the power of God was manifested in these natural phenomena so that people would come to deeply revere God and his power and his authority. And to see the glory of God was a humbling event for these people, to the effect that they would worship God and acknowledge his greatness. And we read of another event in Isaiah chapter 2, that the purpose of God was going to be challenged by his people, by the Jews living in the land of Israel at that time in their idolatry. And he says to them, he warns the people that God would manifest his power and shake the earth, and the result would be that the pride of mankind would be reduced to great humility, their arrogance. And you think of modern times, you think of this great event that took place in 1912, when it was thought technology would solve all the problems of the world, and this vessel, the Titanic, was deemed to be unsinkable. In fact, one crew member said to a passenger, "God himself cannot sink this boat."
It was an act of very defiance.
Within a few days, the pride of man was at the bottom of the sea, and it shocked the world when this actually took place. And so it was when the children of Israel came to Jericho. They surrounded the city. The walls fell at exactly the precise moment that was prescribed when the trumpets were blown, and the city was taken. But there's an important principle here. The principle is that not everybody in that city perished. Not everybody's city in that perished, because what happened was that, as we've got here, in Jericho, some were saved. And this was an important point, because there was one family there that was spared, because they were allowed and they were permitted to live, because they humbled themselves before Almighty God.
So it seems that even with, you could say, the not just natural phenomena, but supernatural phenomena, because it would seem almost impossible that if these mighty walls that even archaeology has proven to have fallen in backwards, were all destroyed, that there must have been one portion of that wall that was still intact.
That is correct. And the family of that woman Rahab was spared. Why? Because she acknowledged the greatness and the power of God. But we have other events in Old Testament and biblical history in relation to Mount Sinai. The prophet Elijah went there in great despair, and God said to him, "Go and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and great strong wind tore the mountain and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. And after the wind there was an earthquake, and after the earthquake there was a fire, and after the fire there was a low whisper, and Elijah heard it, and he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And the effect of that for Elijah was that he was humbled, and that he recognized in his own smallness in the sight of God, and that God was still working and proceeding in his plan, even though Elijah himself did not realize it.
So he had just been shown these fantastic examples of God's power, but God was really trying to communicate on a level that was gentle and compelling.
That is correct. And we read in New Testament times, for example, the time when Christ died, the centurion was at the cross. And when he saw those events, when he saw the earthquake that was there, when he saw it took place, he said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And again, we have the famous incident just 3 days later, at the time of the resurrection of Christ. We read that there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him the guards trembled and became as dead men. And so Christ came out of that tomb, and that event is the foundation of Christianity.
Now, if earthquakes were often used as destructive power, this one was one, as it were, of an unleashing of God's mercy and love by restoring his righteous Son back to life. It was a herald of good things to come for the righteous.
Yes, it was indeed. It was an event where there was a controlled earthquake. Nobody died, somebody came to life. And in the coming to life is very significant in the context of the great Christian message.
Fantastic.
But there's another event in the New Testament. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 16, the gospel is being taken to other parts of the world. And those who proclaimed it were to suffer the consequence of their preaching. They were beaten. They were imprisoned. But these two great men, Paul and Silas, they were praying at midnight. singing hymns and praying. And the prisoners heard them. And suddenly there was this earthquake, a great earthquake that's described, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken. And immediately all the doors of the prison were opened and everyone's bands were loosed. In fact, the jailer, the keeper of the prison, was about to take his own life because he thought the prisoners would all have escaped and gone, and his life would have been forfeit. But that was not the case. Paul said, "Don't worry, we're all here." The keeper came in and he acknowledged the power of that earthquake and the significance of it. And he asked, "What must I do to be saved?" And he was given the great answer that he must believe, which is what he did. And he was saved as a result of the preaching of the gospel and this great earthquake that manifested itself in such a controlled manner.
Fantastic. Martin, thank you so much for a very informative and a fascinating subject that still impacts upon us today. We've looked at earthquakes, disasters, and the end of the world. Today, on our first part of this program, we encourage you to call the numbers that you've seen at the bottom of the screen, attempt to get a hold of us through our website, and stay in tune for the second part of earthquakes, disasters, and the end of the world. Thank you for calling. Thank you for listening. We'll see you soon again. God bless your study of His Word.